Hello and welcome to CJB Games, Cameron here, and today we are continuing work on the game I'm creating called Groundskeeping, a first-person multiplayer hotel maintenance horror game. The first task we'll be completing today is getting the player's Steam name to show up in the lobby browser. This was a rather boring task to start with, and it required a lot of blueprints and a lot of thinking. But I've managed to get it working, and I'm happy with it enough to move on to the next task. Unfortunately, this follows the same theme of not being interesting as well, as it's working on loading screens. I had to create this slightly differently to how I usually would, because these loading screens have two purposes in a multiplayer game. The obvious purpose is allowing the level to load before the player can spawn in, and the other job that these have is to make sure all the clients arrive at the correct level and don't get dropped off from the session. I made a basic design for the loading screen, as I'll probably add the art in a future devlog. Now that these two tasks are all complete, we can continue work with the garage doors that we started last episode. The next thing I want to add to them is the sound of the garage door opening and closing whenever the button is pressed. I spent a fair amount of time trying to get the appropriate attenuation radius set for this to make it believable. I also got the animation of the garage to cue the sound. This means that it replicates over multiplayer a lot more easily than it does via blueprints. One idea I had in regards to gameplay was to have a version of the garage door that would struggle to open or struggle to close. This would potentially be a random occurrence every time the button is pressed, and would hopefully fill the player with dread if they wanted to close the door really quickly whilst being chased by a monster, for example. Having these slower variants of the garage doors meant I had to create edits of the sound so that they would work appropriately for these new versions. Now we can have a little test to see if everything that I've made is working smoothly. So part of the game loop for Groundskeeping was to have the player create a character they would play as. The intention for this was to make the player slightly more attached to their groundskeeper and therefore be more scared when shit hits the fan. This means that if the player dies in the game, their groundskeeper is dead and they will have to create a new one. I'm hoping this will also raise the stakes when they're playing and trying to complete all their tasks. So for this gameplay element, we are going to create the level where the player will name their new character if their original one dies. Creating the widget and the level was not too difficult, and the blueprints were simple enough. As for the art, I'll once again be finishing this later, as I mostly care about functionality for now. I created a box that allowed the player to enter their new name, and if they didn't put anything in there and still attempted to press continue, a message popped up that explains to them that they have to enter a valid name before they proceed. Now that we've added some much needed gameplay mechanics, we can continue work with the environment. Next on the list is the garage floor that needs to be modelled in Blender. As with most of my assets, I will start by exporting the surrounding white box area into Blender to begin with, so I can have a template to work from and it makes sure my scale is all correct. For this section I've included the flat ground of the garage and two little speed bumps that I'll place right before the garage doors. With all this created, I exported all of them to Unreal and began to create the texture of the little bumps in Substance Painter. The texture for the actual ground part will all be sourced from Marketplace, as I don't have time to make a material that's tileable and up to the standard I want. With all that done in Engine, we can begin work on the next feature I want to add to the game, the weather controller. I essentially want there to be a number of different weather scenarios that can spawn at random times. These will include wind, rain, and thunder and lightning. This will most likely take a while to create, so for now I'll just create the blueprints that will spawn everything. I'm piggybacking my code off of the day-night cycle I made earlier, as this is already working over multiplayer. In the end, I decided that every quarter of the day, the game will randomly spawn a weather scenario for the players to enjoy. Hopefully when this is all implemented properly, it will keep the game feeling fresher for longer with the randomness. Now that that's all implemented and ready to be populated, I want to switch back to the garage once again. This time I'll be making the left interior wall, and it basically followed the same process as the floor. I gave the model two different texture slots, as I know when I get it into Engine, I'll want these to be different materials. One being concrete and another being brick. With the edges nice and beveled, we can move on to the back wall of the garage as well. Again, this model was rather simple, but it's necessary to create so we can add the more complicated assets later on. We can see here that with the two material slots, I can easily add the specific materials to the correct areas. Both these materials were from the marketplace and I'm very happy with how they look. Well, there we all have it. that about does it for today, and as you can see, things are starting to shape up nicely with the minimal assets I've added already. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with the continuation of this project. If you want to support me further, you can get my previous game on Steam now.